Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. We are the nonprofit organization that created our podcast here called Rewriting Hollywood, focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, as well as representation and social impact in Hollywood. Really looking at the power of story and storytelling and how it can be harnessed for social good and social change. And today I'm excited to have a couple special guests joining us to talk about their new film, which I had a chance to check out. It's really fantastic. Our guests today, Aidan, and Izzi Rojas, directors of a really fantastic new project. And this is, I think, a really important piece that touches on identity. It touches on family. It just has a lot to say. And we're going to dive into every bit of it. The project is called When Men Were Men. And again, just really excited to kind of explore a lot of issues here. So Aidan, Izzi, thanks so much for being on the show. Excited to have you on.
So excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you.
Awesome. So let's start with the intros. We'd like to kind of start off, if you could indulge us a little bit with kind of your introductions, just about yourselves. I read a bit about your bio. It's really fascinating. So give us, if you could, kind of go around the room and tell us a little about yourselves. What inspired you to get into filmmaking, and especially how did the pathway of kind of acting and directing come to pass?
Sure. I kind of found myself as a young kid in musical theater when I first, I think, followed some friends into it. And then I was like, oh no, this is for me. And then, I'm from Jersey, moving out to LA, I was more immersed in the industry and had done like some writing, made a short myself, but then met Aidan and we worked on When Men Were Men together as their sort of like college thesis. And specifically, or rather like personally, I also try to just infuse social justice, any type of inclusivity, representation as much as I can in my art as well. So really happy to be here.
Yeah, I love that. That's so awesome. And I could definitely tell. Aidan, what about you? Tell us a little about your journey and how did this, give us some hints of how this project start to come to pass.
My name's Aidan. I sort of like grew up like a YouTube kid, doing all that sort of filmmaking from a very young age. So that's what sort of like got me into this space. So I think that's also really what got us into this like sort of DIY, like do it ourselves, like
Definitely
space, and able to make this film. But this film definitely was like a process of our own queer coming of age, and a way for us to navigate sort of toxic masculinity as we were sort of leaning towards more masculine presenting, changing our pronouns and like having surgeries or going on hormones. I think this is our way of sort of navigating that space that we were entering and figuring out what felt right for us and exploring that through the main character, Kieran.
Yeah, let's dive into that. That was a great introduction. So as you both alluded to, this is a piece that touches on the exploration and just to give sense a little bit of the background. If you haven't seen the film, it's kind of set in this heavily religious Irish society. We see a young actor who's struggling with gender identity. It kind of has to let go of what their idea of masculinity is before losing sight of kind of who they are, who he is. And I want to dive into that. Like what sparked, maybe is, if you want to build on what Aidan just said, what sparked, why tell a story now, essentially? What sparked sort of getting going on this? I know you shot it, I think, a couple of years ago. So what prompted this?
Well, like I had mentioned, it definitely was, Aidan was graduating from a screenwriting and editing program. And that was really like, okay, well, maybe we should, that was the timeline. But then also, in order for us to make this project the way we did, piggybacking off what Aidan said, it was sort of our own identity, the time in our lives where we were sort of coming into our own identity. And that DIY kind of approach came about because we were tired of not having representation in the industry, whether it be in front or behind the camera, of people that, you know, are non-binary, are trans. We wanted to just, you know, it had been a long time coming, you know. That's about time, like, why now? Because it should have been, you know, a lot longer ago. Obviously, we were too young personally to do it, but
I think we, like, or at least speaking on like my own experience, like, of media growing up, I think this is a shared experience though, of like from what we had growing up and what we were watching, finding like bits and pieces ourselves in like corners of characters or stories and stuff like that. And I think we just wanted to make something where we could see ourselves flat out on screen. And I personally, I don't think I made this film or like went into making this film as like a need to like be like a social justice movement, because I think there's a Paul Preciado quote, who's this like queer theorist I love, that says that it doesn't start with a call for revolution, but the realization that the revolution is already taking place, that like our existence, our like queer bodies in this space is inherently revolutionary and changing things, and how that should, I think, should be enough, and like the burden of representation or like making the perfect media to represent people, it doesn't need to be like a queer person's responsibility. So I think making this, we really wanted to just like make our story and make it the way we really wanted to. And I think and make that with our queer community too, so it was just infused with all these different experiences, and I think we really achieved that in this process.
I mean, and just finishing up by not waiting for any industry or any large production company. We were just like, okay, this has to happen
our
way and right now, and we're gonna do it ourselves.
Let's touch on that for a moment, because I think that's really interesting. I mean, a lot of times, I think particularly, you know, and being queer myself, a lot of times I know I hear, and we hear through our nonprofit, folks that are telling underrepresented artists, you know, just make it yourself. You know, you have your phone with you, like, figure it out. And I think that is often well-intentioned, but I guess our concern with that is, how do I afford that? How do I do that? You know, what resources do I have? Like, unless you're going to help me, and we're sort of responding obviously to the industry, right? The powers that be. And so unless you're going to help me fund my projects, help me get them off the ground, like, how can we make this happen? And so I just think it's really cool that you were able to make this happen in the way you wanted to make it happen. Could you talk to us, each of you, perhaps about how you went about that? Like, how sort of logistically and financially did you pull it off?
Yeah, I think like we like to acknowledge that while there's also gatekeeping by getting money from industry, and like that's not available to everyone, there's also like a certain amount of gatekeeping of doing it yourself, because like, one, you need to be like for our project at least, like we needed to be able-bodied to do a lot of physical labor to have this happen. And there's all sorts of privileges that came into play in us being able to have this be made. Because we had to like do things like we crowdfunded, and that's like its own full-time job for the months that you're doing it. We to save money, we did a workaway program, so the farm that we shot on, we lived on and worked on, so that was a part of it. And like, to save money, we also, like, the shed that the like love story takes place in, we like built by hand because we couldn't afford to buy one. So like a lot of the things that made us able to do it on such like a low budget had to do with like trading time or like physical labor,
right? Which we're very fortunate to be able to
do.
Right. And I will say also, because you're right, like even us, like going around with this project and talking about doing it ourselves, we recognize that that's still unreachable for a lot of people, no matter what. Because we had already, granted, we only used one lens, one camera, but that we had already owned, right? So that was like already that financial hurdle done. And I think a lot of that was helpful that being said, though, like we're large advocates for, there's also like a mental gatekeeping that the industry sort of instills in us, that we have to be using these, you know, huge certain cameras, big lights, all of
studios,
these
spaces,
right, which that's just simply not true. And I think even though I think even people that like our peers, we talk to them and they're still kind of in that mindset, and we have to say, like, you know, that's not necessary, and to try and like move their mental away from that. But yeah, I think Ireland also, it's shocking that shooting there was a lot cheaper, because as a community they were so sort of like excited and grateful that we were in this small community filming there and being really respectful. And we were allowed to shoot in a lot of spaces for free, in the bar scene, the club, the exterior club shot.
I think we exchanged a lot of time getting to know people instead of paying for these spaces that we like, took that time instead, which also like is money, you know.
Absolutely. Right. We were fortunate enough to have that.
Well, it's typical that you're calling that out, but I think it's also just amazing that you're able to pull it off, because I think it's not easy to do any project, but especially, you know, you're doing something as of kind of through your own team, you know, sort of doing it the way you want to do it, at least to a large extent, which it sounds like you're able to do. Let's talk a little about just some more of the themes of the project, if you don't mind. You know, I think we're recording this day or so before election day here in the US. There's obviously been a lot of political conversation around trans identity, trans bodies, a lot of obviously horribly restrictive and hateful laws and things that are being said. So I just wonder, like, as as this project has started to circulate more in the festival circuit, I know it's done quite well. What are some of the, you know, what are some of the reactions been, and what are some of the impacts so far that you've seen emerge through doing this project?
For me, the biggest impact, I think, while it's been touring around, the biggest impact, I love when like baby queers come to the screenings and are like able to see themselves and are really excited to talk to us afterwards. We love talking to them. But even more directly, like during filmmaking, I think like we touched a lot of people in Ireland specifically about like toxic masculinity, and we're able to make people feel heard by just hearing that this story was being told. So those are the two impacts that I think I've seen. I also think like we have this sort of I think we say like our second biggest audience at festivals and stuff like that is like middle-aged white cis men who like come up to us and are like, I would have never thought of this. So, like that ability to like educate in that way. And I think we always wanted this potentially to be a medium space where people could have their first experience with a trans experience and not potentially harm a trans person or a queer person that they're interfacing with in any way, and able to expose them to something, to a narrative or to one type of person that way. So I think those are like the ways that I've seen it impact people so far.
When we were at our premiere in Austin last October, we made these posters that had an exterior church scene from the film, and then a quote that was referencing the son that Ms. Doyle, the drama teacher, said, but we overlaid it with the church that, you know, he always rises even though every day he falls, you know, capitalize the H, because we wanted to get those people that would otherwise, you know, if they knew what the film was about, would never have come to see it, but maybe, you know, with a little bit of trickery they could get into a space that otherwise they would never have experience in a safe way. So that was a little bit of our tactic to like
that's a little why we named it When Men Were Men Too. Not only one to subvert that saying, but also to like maybe bring unassuming people. I really admire the way that the movie Spring Breakers did their publicist, and it brought in the Spring Breaker crowd to sort of then have a commentary made on them. So we kind of were trying to do that a little bit with our marketing and our titling and how we made posters around for festivals and stuff.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. Did you both feel that was important to do in particular because of where our society is now? Like it just seems like it's so hard, having spent a good amount of time myself in politics. Like it just seems like it's so hard to reach folks who disagree from us or don't see us, right? Or vice versa, unless you kind of run into them in some space, or like the media is so fragmented, our circles are so fragmented. I mean, was that part of the thinking too, that, hey, we really want to open some dialogue and kind of let people see queer folks for who we are and sort of see a story for, that's honest and true? Like, was that some of the thinking as well?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I don't think we like wanted to put too much work on ourselves to be like, oh,
No.
we have to reach these people, we have to educate them.
Right.
But I think we made a story that I think has universal, while like very nuanced and specific queer like experiences, like speaks to hypermasculinity in all ways, and that affects all people at all times. So I feel like we felt that if we could market it in any way to get those people in, and we've already done this work and done it, so like why not have it show to them? We don't have to like talk to them and explain to them, why not have that be a resource that people can access in that way?
Yeah, because I mean, we're very aware that a lot of people who are transphobic has simply never interfaced with a trans person, or vice versa. I mean,
right.
Yeah. Again, it wasn't like, we didn't take on that responsibility completely, thinking it was our necessary for us to do that work, but it just sort of was, because that was our experience of trying to present masculinely and then kind of going all the way to one side of the spectrum, into toxicity, and then having to find our way back. It does just speak to a larger audience.
Yeah, it's really neat. And obviously, I think it can be an unfair burden for sure to put, as we meet with a lot of filmmakers who are marginalized in some way, to sort of put like, this is your job to fix everything, with this one project, right? Which is so
we always do. We hope queer people can get to a space where they make bad film. They can make a bad film and it doesn't have like a repercussion on
other queer filmmakers.
Yes, absolutely, 1,000%. And the pressure there is real, not only for the queer community, but obviously for intersexual communities, color, etc. Let's talk a little about masculinity, hypermasculinity. She's mentioned toxic masculinity, which this film definitely dives into, which I think is so needed, especially now, probably for all time, all time. But like, let's unpack that a little bit. Like, what were some of the themes you wanted to explore there, or that maybe kept coming up that you felt like were important through the lens of these characters, through the lens of the story, to share? Like, give us a sense of, and also, what do you mean when you think about toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, for those who are listening, may have heard these terms but not fully grasped them?
For me, when I started to transition, I grew up mainly with my mom and my two sisters, and then we were like all girls, girl power. And I like enjoyed growing up that way, and it felt like a part of me. But then when I started transition, because I wanted things that felt more masculine, felt more affirming, I felt that I had to like abandon femininity. And that feels like to me a part of toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, that this like like weakness in femininity, or like that being sort of cosmetic and something you need to wipe yourself of in order to present in this way. And I think this process was a lot of me learning that is not the case at all. There's a marriage of the two, being able to find where I fit in the middle, and that comes with a little bit of like figuring out what actually feels good versus what has been learned through experience and upbringing. So that for me, it feels like where the like exploration of masculinity comes from. And in this film, I feel like we a little bit played each other in our roles. We played where I feel like, and I feel like you've spoken maybe a little differently too, but I felt you as a person at a time presented more femininely, and but also, and so I felt to be able to explore that side as Egan was really good for me. And I feel like vice versa. Like we wore each other's clothes. Like that was like we switched roles and stuff like that for wardrobe. But it felt like a cool like trying the other perspective and making it your own as an actor and a director.
Yeah, I mean, and just speaking to like gender roles and hyper toxic masculinity, but just like the whole spectrum in general, I think like blanket expectations of, that, you have to act, respond a certain way based on gender, I think is really like broadly where a lot of problems lie. And like, touching on what you just said, writing and like, and writing Egan and seeing him come to life in Aidan, and then also like playing Kieran, has definitely allowed me to say, okay, I identify as transmasculine, but that doesn't have to look a certain way. That simply, I still can grow out my hair and wear, whatever I want, even present femininely, and still identify the way that I feel, I want to and am. So that definitely has helped both of us, I think, like through this process in our own gender identity. And
I also feel like we get a funny question a lot that sort of exposes a little bit of like the ideas of like inherent masculinity, because I as a trans person play a cis character, and a lot of people are like, well, how was that? Like, was that hard? And I'm like, well, what is this like inherent like idea that like that masculinity was like a hard thing to put on, and like femininity is like an easier thing to put on? Because I feel like I've been reading a lot about like society feeling that like masculinity is inherent while femininity is cosmetic. So like this idea that you can put on femininity easily and like take it off and sort of like have it as this caricature of yourself, but you're not born, if you weren't born a male, that like inherent quality of yours is not something you can just put on as like an act. So I feel like that question exposes a little bit of that like feeling we have in our society, because people are like, was it difficult? And I'm like, not anymore. Like, no.
It was exactly a role. And it's sort of like the cis actors that have played trans, many of them won Oscars for it. Obviously don't seem to get like, it's sort of just like a feat, and that's cool. You're acting. Wow, you're so good at it. Kind of reaction to that.
Absolutely right.
I guess it was a follow up to that. Like, just really curious to hear both your perspectives, and I'm sure our audience too. Like, it does seem like there's a bit of an obsession with. And I don't think obsession is too strong of a word. I mean, you could correct me if I'm wrong, with in our society with masculinity and what that means, right? There's sort of this constant kind of, but I'm speaking mostly to sort of folks on, without naming names, although I can, sort of folks on the right who sort of are constantly like defensive, right? Sort of like, don't come in our bathrooms, don't come in our schools, like don't indoctrinate us. They use that word a lot. Like don't like don't indoctrinate our children, like don't force them to be like all etc. So for all the things I'm sure you've heard, but like, could you both comment on that in terms of why you feel like, particularly in the US and other parts of the world, but certainly in the US, that we have this sort of, I would describe it as an obsession with sort of defining what masculinity is and kind of like making sure those quote unquote boundaries are not eroded. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think in America, though, just largely in the world, religion does play a big part of that. I'm going to specifically call out like Catholicism, Christianity, and speaking to the film, how we have, I don't know what psalm it is in the church scene, I can't remember, but what the preach is saying, wives, submit to your husbands. This very stark like separation of man and woman and duty that comes with that, and like you said, like maintaining that sense of like hierarchy in masculinity, I think really does play a big part, and specifically in America and American politics, and like maintaining that those roles and gender roles, I think plays a really large part. we didn't want to, one of the smaller reasons why we chose Ireland as the location is because we knew that the only other place that we were familiar with that would kind of have the duality of like a large city being a place where you know, queer, just people in general have like looser ideas of the binary and, you know, and gender and expectation, but then you go like 30 minutes outside of the city and it's, you know, still extremely conservative in those respects. We didn't want to film in the American South because it's like that much scarier, honestly.
Yeah.
And Ireland still has that, but yeah, I would say, and maybe just like really specifically in relation to the film, I would say like religion has a large part, I believe.
I also think, to what I was saying before, the idea that masculinity is inherent is like a protection for its actual like super fragility in the way that that we perform it and that it's performed, and that all of these like staunch like keep out of here or you can't do this is because that like it's felt so fragile in with these people individually. And that like causes a sort of like defensive reaction.
Absolutely.
And so I think that is exposed like in the narratives of our films too, and we're like I think we saw a lot in Ireland with the men that we would talk to and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that plays a big part into like why these people's reactions are so strong this way, is because there's a certain fragility to it.
Yeah, unconsciously or consciously, I think.
Yeah, it does seem like there's a lot of fear there, and I think fragility is a great word to think about, and for folks to reflect on too, especially those who identify as male in our audience. I think you know, there's sort of a lot of I feel like kind of deflecting even on things like abortion rights and other issues where it's sort of like women need to figure that out, but actually of course it's people who identify as men to
and I feel like with all things like that, like with racism, fat phobia, there's like it's like a lifelong journey of like sort of like unlearning these things and like educating yourself in a process of I think we learned this too on the and like this sort of mindset working on this film of like the idea in America or elsewhere of like being grown up and you're like done learning, and that anything that tests that is sort of something that makes you defensive, you know. But like more this idea of like if you're like offending your amount of knowledge if you have to learn something new, you know. But for all of those like intersectional learning points, I feel like it's like a lifelong learning process with like masculinity and stuff like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's a great point too. Like it should be lifelong. I think folks sometimes seem like they shut down at a certain age, or maybe never were allowed to be open to have those vulnerable conversations and experiences, particularly those who identify as male. I wanted to ask about kind of where you go from here, because you know we're at an interesting moment, at least that we see in the industry, where there are more efforts at inclusion for trans folks, for non-binary folks, for others. There's more representation perhaps than we've ever seen at least in the film industry, to an extent the TV industry too, of course. Like what do you think the world looks like? I guess two-part question. What do you think the world looks like if we have more trans and non-binary folks behind the camera, like yourselves, telling these stories, greenlighting them? But also, like, what would you like to see to make that happen? So I guess sort of a two-parter. How do we get there? And also, like, what is storytelling look like when we have that inclusion in real time?
Yeah, I think funding, like those people in marginalized identities, giving them money in some way, you know, that is truly the dream. There's one way to get there. I think, listening. I mean, and that's quite vague, because it's sort of like, it's so almost easy to imagine getting there, because there's such limited amount of like things holding us back, but they're so strong.
I think it's about like also if like you are in any position like how we were with this film to bring on queer people for different aspects of your film, like prioritizing that.
Absolutely.
And also, yeah, bringing on those people to like expand stories in ways you never thought. And I think to the second point of thing, like of your question of what it would look like, I think it would, like we said earlier, just look like queer people being able to make the stories they want, regardless of like, because I think a lot of people worry about like representing a community with their films, and that changes their projects a lot. And that's why I think it means queer people being able to make film in the same way straight people do, and that is like telling
Freely.
whatever story is touching to them, and
Yeah.
that'll be infused with their experience because it's their unique point of view. But yeah, I just hope the future is full of like many different intersections of storytelling and different ways of telling stories and expanding the ways we watch film or films presented.
I think that would be
and who we
inherent.
see.
Yeah, it would be inherent within like the expansion of who's behind the camera, like through a queer lens, because as a queer person, you have to navigate the world. I mean, unfortunately, in the world that we in, you have to find new ways of existing, of identifying, of surviving. And I think that would, you ask like what it would look like, and I think that it would just truly propel us into a new age of like digital art and media, because like that is inherent within the queer community, is pushing boundaries and always finding new ways of doing things, because you have to. So I think that hopefully it'll start.
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think it's such a good point too about the queer lens and like the gaze that we, literal gaze that we as filmmakers or creators are putting on to the characters, and then in turn what the audience is seeing, right? And just so how powerful that is. It is almost, I feel like, something that you don't know it until you don't know you're missing it sometimes until you see it, and you're like, oh, that feels completely different.
Exactly.
Yeah, in a good way. Well, this is so fantastic. It's such a great project. It's also really important, and so I appreciate your patience with the questions in terms of just the impact of this. Again, the project is When Men Were Men. It's going to be, it's traveling around the festival circuit. Do you guys, are there plans for y'all to kind of release more widely? What does that look like for folks to see?
Yeah, it's playing right now in LA for like a week long and till the 10th of November, but then it's also going to Chicago and then New Jersey, and then I think in the summertime or later in the new year, it's going to be also in P-Town, Massachusetts, and then back in LA. We're trying to take it to a lot of LGBTQ centers, really show it to the community. And then fingers crossed by the new year it'll be streaming too.
Okay, amazing. Okay, so we're excited to hear about that. Definitely let us know when it's live. But again, thank you so much for being on. Aidan, Izzi, Rojas, director, stars, multiple hats of this project. It's really terrific. I hope folks will check it out. Thanks again to both of you for being on the show.
Thank you so much.
Truly.